The crisp autumn air seeped through the cracks in the windows, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Inside Clara's childhood home, warmth radiated from the kitchen, where laughter echoed like an old familiar song. The table was crowded, plates piled high with food, glasses clinking together in cheerful toasts, and voices overlapping as stories were shared. It was a scene that had played out countless times before, yet tonight felt different. Clara sat beside Daniel, her husband of 5 years, who leaned back in his chair, laughing at one of her father's jokes. His hand rested casually on her knee, a gesture meant to be affectionate, but which now felt more habitual than heartfelt. She smiled along with everyone else, nodding when appropriate, but there was a quiet distance between her and the moment. Lately, their marriage had settled into a rhythm so predictable it left her feeling hollow. The spark they once had, the late-night conversations, the stolen glances across rooms, had dimmed, replaced by routines and responsibilities. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door swinging open, followed by Uncle Marcus's booming voice. "Sorry, I'm late. You know how traffic gets this time of year." He strode into the dining room with his usual flair, shrugging off his coat and tossing it onto the nearest chair. As always, he commanded attention without trying. With his sharp wit and easy charm, Marcus had a way of lighting up any room he entered. Tonight was no exception. He launched into a story about getting lost on the way over, exaggerating details until even Clara's usually stoic father was chuckling. Marcus took his seat directly across from Clara, flashing her one of his signature grins, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes and revealed just enough mischief to make you wonder what he was thinking. For a moment, everything seemed normal. He was simply being Marcus, the life of the party, the uncle everyone adored. But then, as the meal progressed and the conversation flowed around them, Clara noticed something unsettling. Beneath the table, she felt the faintest brush of his foot against hers. At first, she dismissed it as accidental. Perhaps he'd shifted in his seat or stretched his legs without realizing. Yet moments later, it happened again, this time deliberate, unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat and she froze, unsure how to react. No one else seemed to notice. The chatter continued uninterrupted. Across the table, Marcus carried on as if nothing had happened, regaling the group with another animated tale. But Clara couldn't shake the sensation of his touch, lingering on her skin, subtle yet charged with intent. She glanced at Daniel, hoping for some anchor to steady herself, but he was engrossed in a discussion with her father about work projects. Their exchange was lighthearted, filled with mutual admiration and camaraderie, but to Clara it felt worlds away. Panic began to rise in her chest, though she masked it with a tight smile and a sip of water. Why wasn't she saying anything? Why hadn't she moved her foot away? And then, as if sensing her unease, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his grin widening as he met her gaze. There was something knowing in his expression, something that made her stomach twist. Clara looked down at her plate, focusing intently on cutting a piece of chicken into smaller bites, anything to avoid meeting his eyes again. But the damage was done. The fleeting contact lingered in her mind, unshakable, unsettling, and strangely intoxicating. As the evening wore on, Clara found herself hyper-aware of Marcus's presence. Every movement he made, every laugh he let out, seemed amplified. And though she tried to convince herself it was all in her head, she couldn't deny the tension simmering beneath the surface. A tension that promised to complicate things far beyond this quiet family dinner. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just an accident, a fleeting misstep in the chaos of elbows and knees beneath the table. But then it happened again. This time, there was no mistaking the intention behind it. His hand slid onto my knee, warm and firm, sending a jolt through me that froze every thought in my mind. My breath caught sharply, lodging itself somewhere between my chest and throat as panic surged within me. I didn't move. I couldn't. The room seemed to shrink around me, the laughter and chatter growing distant, muffled, like sounds heard underwater. No one noticed. Or, at least, no one let on if they did. Daniel sat beside me, his face animated as he discussed some new project with Dad, gesturing enthusiastically with his fork. He hadn't seen Marcus's hand snake under the tablecloth. He hadn't felt the weight of those fingers pressing into my skin. How could he? To him, everything was normal. Just another family dinner, just another evening filled with stories and shared meals. But for me, the world had tilted off its axis. I glanced at Daniel, hoping his presence might anchor me, but he was completely absorbed in their conversation. His obliviousness stung more than I expected, leaving me feeling isolated, even though I wasn't alone. Panic clawed at my chest, rising like bile, but still I stayed silent. What could I say? "Excuse me, everyone, but Uncle Marcus is touching me?" The words felt absurd, impossible to voice without shattering the fragile veneer of normalcy we'd all been so carefully maintaining. Marcus leaned forward slightly, pretending to listen intently to Aunt Susan's story about her recent trip to Europe. His expression was casual, almost bored, but his fingers betrayed him. They moved higher up my thigh, deliberate and steady, each inch they traveled igniting a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. At first, revulsion dominated, a visceral reaction to the violation of boundaries I hadn't realized were being tested until now. But beneath that initial wave of disgust came something else, something far more confusing. A flicker of arousal that made my stomach twist with shame. How could this be happening? How could I feel anything other than repulsion? Yet there it was, an undeniable warmth spreading through me, unbidden and unwelcome. It wasn't desire, not really. It was something darker, more primal, a response I couldn't control any more than I could stop my heart from racing. My body betrayed me, reacting to the intimacy of his touch despite the alarm bells ringing loudly in my mind. I tried to shift away, subtly, imperceptibly, hoping to create enough distance to break the spell, but his grip tightened, anchoring me in place. His fingers pressed harder against my leg, possessive and unyielding. The message was clear: you're not going anywhere. My pulse quickened, adrenaline coursing through me as I debated whether to slap his hand away or call out, to expose what he was doing right here, in front of everyone. But the thought of causing a scene, of turning this cozy family gathering into something ugly and irreparable, kept me rooted to the spot. Instead, I focused on breathing, on keeping my expression neutral, as if nothing unusual were happening. Inside, though, my thoughts spiraled wildly. Was I imagining this? Had I somehow encouraged him without realizing it? No, that couldn't be true. This wasn't my fault. And yet, doubt crept in, whispering cruel lies that only deepened my unease. His touch grew bolder, tracing slow, deliberate circles along my thigh. Each movement sent conflicting signals ricocheting through me. Disgust warring with curiosity, fear tangled with a strange, intoxicating thrill. It was wrong, so very wrong, but in that moment, with the rest of the world fading into background noise, it also felt dangerously real. But growing through grief, I underestimated the intensity. And that was when I realized the minutes felt like hours, each one stretching endlessly as Marcus's hand lingered on my thigh, his fingers tracing patterns that sent shivers racing through me. My mind was a storm of contradictions, panic and desire colliding in ways I couldn't untangle. How had this happened? Why wasn't I stopping him? The questions screamed at me, but the answers eluded me, buried beneath layers of confusion and shame. I knew what Marcus was doing was wrong, so undeniably morally wrong. He was family, practically an uncle to me, someone who had been part of our lives for years. This wasn't just inappropriate, it was reprehensible. Yet even as guilt gnawed at the edges of my conscience, there was something else, a thrill that coursed through me, sharp and electric. It was the secrecy of it, the forbidden nature of his touch under the table while everyone around us laughed and talked, oblivious to the line we were crossing. For a fleeting moment, I let myself sink into the sensation, allowing the weight of his hand to anchor me to something raw and dangerous. But the guilt came roaring back almost instantly, clawing at my chest, making it hard to breathe. When dessert was finally served, Marcus withdrew his hand, leaving behind only the ghost of his touch. I exhaled sharply, realizing I'd been holding my breath for far too long. Trembling, I pushed my chair back abruptly, mumbling something about needing the bathroom before anyone could notice how flustered I was. My legs felt unsteady as I walked down the hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears like a relentless drumbeat. Once inside the small, dimly lit bathroom, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, closing my eyes for a moment to steady myself. When I opened them again, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me in the mirror. My dad, Fred, and Will were waiting at the end of the hallway. From the mirror, her cheeks were flushed, her lips slightly parted, her eyes wide with shock and something darker, something I didn't want to name. Was that excitement? Disgust twisted in my stomach at the thought, but I couldn't deny the truth staring back at me. How had I let things escalate so far? Why hadn't I slapped his hand away or called him out right then and there? The silence I'd chosen felt heavier now, pressing down on me until it was hard to stand upright. And I splashed cold water on my face, hoping it would clear my thoughts, but all it did was heighten the chaos swirling inside me. Was this my fault? Had I somehow encouraged him without realizing it? Maybe the way I'd laughed at his jokes earlier or the casual smile I'd given him when he sat down. It didn't seem possible that such small gestures could have led to this, but doubt crept in anyway. Or maybe it wasn't me at all. Maybe Marcus was entirely to blame, using his charm and confidence to manipulate the situation, to test boundaries he knew shouldn't be tested. But if that was true, why hadn't I stopped him sooner? Why had I frozen instead of speaking up? The questions looped endlessly in my mind, each one more suffocating than the last. I gripped the edge of the sink tightly, trying to ground myself in the cool porcelain beneath my fingers. None of this made sense. None of it should have happened. And yet, here I was, trembling and flushed, unable to shake the memory of his touch or the conflicting emotions it stirred within me. As I stared at my reflection, I realized the hardest question of all was still unanswered. What was I going to do now? Back at the table, I kept my eyes trained on anything but Marcus. The clatter of dishes and silverware provided a convenient distraction as I busied myself clearing plates, stacking them with more care than necessary. My hands moved mechanically, but my mind was elsewhere, reliving every detail of what had just happened under that tablecloth. His touch lingered in my memory like an unwelcome shadow, refusing to be shaken off no matter how hard I tried. I replayed it all, the brush of his foot against mine, the deliberate slide of his hand onto my knee, the way his fingers had traced higher up my thigh. Each moment felt seared into my consciousness, vivid and unrelenting. And then came the realization that made my stomach churn. Part of me had enjoyed it. Not just the physical sensation, though there was no denying the thrill that had coursed through me. It was the danger, the illicitness, the sheer wrongness of it all that had stirred something deep within me, something I hadn't felt in years. The thought disgusted me. How could I have let this happen? Worse still, how could I have allowed myself to feel even a flicker of pleasure from it? I clenched my jaw, gripping the edge of a plate so tightly my knuckles turned white. This wasn't who I was supposed to be. I valued loyalty, stability, tradition, all the things Daniel represented. Yet here I was, wrestling with emotions I couldn't reconcile. Emotions that left me feeling dirty and ashamed. When everyone finally dispersed to different corners of the house, I retreated upstairs, desperate for space to breathe. But lying next to Daniel later that night, the weight of my guilt pressed down on me harder than ever. His gentle snores filled the room, rhythmic and familiar, a reminder of the comfort and safety he provided. For 5 years, we'd built a life together, a good one by all accounts. He was kind, dependable, loving in his own quiet way. But now, as I listened to him sleep beside me, those qualities seemed less like strengths and more like signs of monotony. Our marriage had settled into a predictable rhythm, one I'd once found reassuring but now realized had dulled some essential spark inside me. And then there was Marcus. His boldness, his audacity. It awakened feelings I thought were long buried, feelings I didn't want to confront. The contrast between him and Daniel was stark. almost cruel. Where Daniel offered calm and consistency, Marcus brought chaos and risk. And though I hated myself for admitting it, even silently, in the privacy of my own mind, I couldn't deny the rush of excitement that still lingered in my veins, a low hum beneath my skin. My chest tightened as guilt overwhelmed me. What kind of person was I if I could entertain such thoughts? Daniel deserved better than this, and he deserved a wife who didn't feel torn between duty and desire, between right and wrong. But no matter how many times I told myself these truths, they didn't erase the tangled web of emotions spinning in my head. I turned onto my side, staring at the faint outline of Daniel's profile in the dim light filtering through the curtains. Even asleep, he exuded a sense of peace, of contentment. It should have been enough. The suggestion, however, made me laugh. It had been enough for a while, but now I felt disconnected. Adrift in a sea of contradictions I didn't know how to navigate. Marcus's actions were reprehensible, crossing boundaries that should never have been touched. Yet the memory of his touch refused to fade, lingering like a ghost, haunting the edges of my thoughts. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to think of anything else, to focus on Daniel's steady breathing, the soft rustle of the sheets, the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Anything to drown out the voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't entirely blameless in all of this. But the truth was unavoidable. I had let it happen. Worse, I had felt something, and I couldn't undo that. That put him in the foster care system, and all I could do was lie there, trapped in the suffocating silence of my own mind, wrestling with emotions I didn't want to face but couldn't escape. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog, each step heavier than the last. I couldn't shake the memory of that dinner, the way Marcus's touch had lingered on my skin, the way his gaze had pierced through me with an intensity I hadn't expected. And still gasping for breath, I thought it haunted me, replaying in fragments during quiet moments when I should have been focused on anything else. My mind dissected every detail, every choice I'd made or failed to make. Did I encourage him somehow? Could I have stopped him without turning the evening into chaos? The questions looped endlessly, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Sleep became elusive, my nights stretching into hours of staring at the ceiling while Daniel's steady breathing filled the room beside me. His presence was comforting, familiar, yet it only deepened the guilt coiled tightly in my chest. How could I lie here next to him, feeling so disconnected? He was everything good and stable, loyalty personified, and yet, as much as I tried to push it away, the thought of Marcus stirred something darker within me, something primal and untamed. By day, I moved through life like a ghost, going through the motions but unable to focus. Conversations blurred together, tasks slipped from my mind before they were finished. Even simple decisions felt overwhelming, as though the weight of what had happened pressed down on every action I took. I avoided family gatherings, making excuses about errands or work projects, anything to keep from being in the same room as Marcus. Yet, even in his absence, he was there, in the corner of my thoughts, in the faint brush of fabric against my leg that sent my pulse racing for no reason. And then came the comparisons. Unbidden and unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. Daniel was safety. He was warmth and kindness, someone who had stood by me through thick and thin. When life got hard, he was the one who held me close, who reminded me we could weather any storm together. But Marcus? Marcus was fire. He was risk and unpredictability, a force that demanded attention rather than asked for it. Where Daniel offered calm waters, Marcus brought waves crashing over me, leaving me breathless and disoriented. I hated myself for even thinking this way. Comparing them wasn't fair. To either of them, Daniel deserved better than to be measured against someone like Marcus, whose very nature seemed designed to disrupt. And yet, the truth refused to stay buried. Marcus had awakened something inside me, something I'd thought I'd lost. Years ago, desire, passion, a hunger for more than just the predictable rhythm of our lives. It terrified me because it didn't align with who I believed myself to be. I wasn't supposed to crave excitement or danger. I was supposed to value stability, commitment, love. But now, those ideals felt hollow, overshadowed by the raw emotions Marcus had stirred. One afternoon, as I sat alone in the living room, flipping through a magazine I wasn't really reading, I found myself staring at the coffee table where Marcus had leaned forward during dinner, laughing at one of Uncle Robert's jokes. His confidence had been magnetic, drawing everyone in, including me. Had I subconsciously invited his advances? Was there some part of me that wanted this? Wanted him, even if I couldn't admit it? Oh, I whispered aloud, shaking my head as if the word itself could banish the thought. This wasn't about wanting Marcus. This was about regret, confusion, fear. I needed to fix this, to find a way back to the woman I used to be, the one who valued her marriage above all else. But how could I do that when I barely recognized myself anymore? Daniel walked in then, carrying a stack of papers he'd been reviewing for work. "Hey," he said, smiling softly. "You okay? You've seemed distracted lately." His concern cut through me like a knife. Here he was, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside me, still caring enough to notice when something was wrong. That was Daniel. Always attentive, always loving. Guilt surged anew, choking me with its weight. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." He nodded, setting the papers aside and sitting beside me. For a moment, he simply watched me, his brow furrowed slightly. Then he reached out, taking my hand in his. "If something's bothering you, you can talk to me. You know that, right?" Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away quickly. "No, hi." Talking to him was the last thing I could do. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? Instead, I squeezed his hand, leaning into him briefly before pulling away. "I know," I said quietly. "Thanks." But as he returned to his papers, I couldn't help but wonder, would he still look at me the same way if he knew the truth? Would he forgive me for letting Marcus cross that line and for not stopping him sooner? Or worse, would he see me differently as someone capable of betrayal, even if it hadn't gone further than fleeting touches under the table? The questions swirled endlessly, leaving me trapped in a cycle of self-recrimination. Marcus had ignited a spark within me, one I both feared and craved, but indulging it meant risking everything I held dear. And yet, ignoring it felt equally impossible. Whatever path I chose, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The invitation came unexpectedly, a simple text from my mother asking if I'd like to join her for lunch. At first, I almost declined. The thought of sitting across from someone who might ask probing questions or notice the cracks in my carefully constructed facade felt unbearable. But then again, maybe that was exactly what I needed, a distraction, anything to keep my mind off the suffocating guilt and confusion that had taken up residence in my chest since that night. "Yes," I replied quickly before I could second-guess myself. "Lunch sounds nice." The restaurant she chose was quaint, one of those places with checkered tablecloths and menus handwritten on chalkboards. It smelled faintly of garlic bread and fresh coffee, a comforting aroma that did little to ease the knot twisting in my stomach. My mother greeted me with her usual warmth, pulling me into a hug that lingered just long enough to make me feel guilty for keeping secrets from her. "You look tired, sweetheart," she said as we settled into our seats. Her tone was gentle, concerned, but not prying. At least not yet. "Everything okay?" "Just work stress," I lied smoothly, forcing a smile. "Nothing serious." She nodded, accepting the explanation without question, and launched into an update about family gossip. I listened half-heartedly, nodding at appropriate intervals while picking at the bread basket. But then casually, almost offhandedly, she mentioned Marcus. "He seemed to have such a good time at dinner last week," she said, smiling fondly. "You know how much he loves catching up with everyone. He told me it reminded him of old times." My fingers froze mid-reach for another slice of bread. My throat tightened, and I forced myself to swallow past the lump forming there. "Oh yeah?" I managed, my voice coming out higher than intended. "That's great." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded with meaning I wasn't ready to unpack. Marcus had enjoyed himself? Of course he had. To him, it probably was just another casual evening, nothing more than a fleeting moment of amusement. But for me, it was anything but harmless fun. Every glance, every touch replayed in my mind like a broken record, each memory amplifying the shame and anger simmering beneath the surface. By the time dessert arrived, I could barely taste the chocolate cake in front of me. All I wanted was to escape, to get away from the weight of my own thoughts. And as soon as the check was paid, I made my excuses and left. My mother's parting hug feeling like a lifeline I didn't deserve. Later that day, I found myself standing outside a quiet cafe downtown, staring at its unassuming sign as if it held all the answers I desperately sought. Confronting Marcus hadn't been part of my plan when I woke up this morning. In fact, I'd spent most of the week avoiding him entirely, dodging calls and steering clear of family gatherings. But after my mother's innocent comment, something inside me snapped. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I needed answers, even if they terrified me. I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly. Marcus was already seated at a corner table, sipping espresso with the same confident smirk that always seemed to irritate me. When he saw me approach, his expression brightened, though there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Clara," he said warmly, gesturing for me to sit. "This is a surprise. What brings you here?" His casual demeanor only fueled my frustration. How could he act so normal, so unaffected, when my world felt like it was crumbling around me? I slid into the chair opposite him, clutching my purse tightly in my lap as if it might anchor me to reality. "I need to talk to you," I said bluntly, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound calm. He raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "About what, dear niece?" The way he said it, so dismissive, so condescending, made my blood boil. "Don't play dumb," I snapped, louder than I intended. A few heads turned in our direction, but I didn't care. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Why did you do it? Why would you touch me like that?" For a moment, he looked genuinely surprised, though whether it was genuine or just another act, I couldn't tell. Then his lips curled into that infuriating smirk again, and he shrugged lazily. "Do what?" he asked, his tone dripping with feigned innocence. "Catch up with family? Enjoy a pleasant evening over dinner?" "No," I shot back, my hands gripping the edge of the table now. "You know damn well what I mean. What happened under the table. Don't pretend it didn't happen." His smirk faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of something darker. Amusement, maybe? Or satisfaction at having rattled me. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And if I don't pretend? What then, Clara? Are you going to tell everyone? Ruin the family dynamic over a harmless bit of fun?" "Harmless?" I echoed, incredulous. "It wasn't harmless. You crossed a line, a big one, and you knew exactly what you were doing." He sighed dramatically, as if I were being unreasonable. "Come now, let's not blow this out of proportion. It was a moment of weakness, nothing more. We're both adults here. Surely you can see that, a moment of weakness," I repeated, my voice rising again. "That's your excuse? Do you even realize how messed up that is?" He shrugged again, his expression unreadable. "People make mistakes, Clara. Maybe I shouldn't have done it, but it doesn't change the fact that it happened. And honestly, from where I'm sitting, it seems like you're making a bigger deal out of this than it deserves." His words hit me like a slap, leaving me speechless for a moment. Was he really trying to twist this around to make it seem like I was the problem? Anger surged through me, sharp and overwhelming. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're unbelievable," I spat, glaring down at him. "This isn't over, Marcus. I won't let you manipulate me or anyone else. Ever again." With that, I turned and stormed out of the cafe, my heart pounding and my hands shaking. The confrontation hadn't gone the way I'd hoped. It hadn't brought me closure or clarity, but it had given me something else: resolve. No matter what happened next, I vowed never to let him hold power over me again. The weeks that followed were a blur of introspection and quiet resolve. I couldn't shake the weight of what had happened with Marcus, but it wasn't guilt alone that lingered. It was something deeper, more unsettling. For the first time in years, I felt like I didn't recognize myself. Who was this woman who could be so easily swayed by attention, by danger, by the thrill of the forbidden? The questions haunted me, circling endlessly in my mind until I knew I needed to do something, anything, to make sense of them. I started journaling at night, pouring my thoughts onto paper and messy scrawls. At first, the words came haltingly, fragmented and disjointed. I think, what if my birthday is an attempt to survive? But as the days passed, they began to flow more freely, revealing truths I hadn't dared to confront before. Writing became a kind of therapy, a way to untangle the knots inside me. I wrote about my marriage, the comfort, the monotony, the unspoken distance between Daniel and me. I wrote about Marcus too, not to justify his actions or mine, but to understand why I'd reacted the way I did. And slowly, painfully, I began to see patterns emerge. It wasn't about Marcus. Not really. He was just a catalyst, a mirror reflecting parts of myself I'd long ignored. My reaction to him stemmed from something far older, buried deep beneath layers of responsibility, routine, and compromise. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost pieces of myself, the passion, the spontaneity, the hunger for life that used to define me. Marriage had brought stability, yes, but it had also dulled the edges of my personality, smoothing out the sharpness that once made me feel alive. Determined to dig deeper, I booked an appointment with a therapist, a decision that terrified me almost as much as it excited me. And sitting across from her in that cozy office, surrounded by soft lighting and shelves lined with books, I felt exposed yet strangely safe. She listened without judgment as I stumbled through my story, piecing together fragments of my emotions. Sometimes, she said gently, we seek outside what we're missing within. Her words struck a chord, resonating with everything I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. And it wasn't Marcus who awakened those feelings, it was the emptiness he tapped into, the longing I'd refused to acknowledge. With newfound clarity, I began rediscovering parts of myself I thought I'd left behind. I dusted off my old watercolor set, which had sat untouched in the closet since our wedding. Painting had always been my escape, a way to channel emotions I couldn't put into words. In the end, I wrote a bunch of stories during a time of extreme sorrow. I decided to become a painter. As I dipped my brush into vibrant hues and watched colors blend on the page, I felt a spark of joy return, a small but significant reminder of who I used to be. I joined a local art class, meeting people who shared my love for creativity. Their energy was infectious, reigniting passions I hadn't realized I missed. At home, I started having honest conversations with Daniel. They weren't easy. Vulnerability never is. One evening after dinner, I broached the topic hesitantly. "Do you ever think about us?" I asked, tracing the rim of my wine glass. "Not just where we are now, but where we want to go?" Daniel looked up, surprised. "Of course," he said. "Why do you ask?" "I guess I've been wondering if we've stopped dreaming together," I admitted. "We have this beautiful life, but sometimes it feels predictable." He nodded thoughtfully, setting his glass down. "I get that. Maybe we've fallen into habits instead of growing together." That conversation marked the beginning of something new between us. We talked openly about our dreams, fears, and even fantasies, things we'd never dared to discuss before. Some nights, we laughed over silly ideas. Other times, we delved into heavier topics, uncovering insecurities we'd kept hidden. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments when discomfort threatened to silence us. But each discussion brought us closer, reminding me why I fell in love with him in the first place. Through it all, I carried the lessons I'd learned from confronting my own desires and boundaries. What happened with Marcus would always be a shadow hanging over me, a reminder of how easily I could lose sight of myself. But it also taught me the importance of self-awareness, of nurturing the parts of me that craved excitement and fulfillment. I vowed to keep rediscovering those pieces, not for anyone else, but for me. By the end of those weeks, I felt lighter, as though I'd shed a layer of guilt and confusion. I still didn't condone Marcus's behavior, nor did I forgive myself entirely for letting it happen. But I understood now that the experience forced me to face truths I'd avoided for too long. With Daniel by my side, I felt ready to rebuild not just our marriage, but myself. And for the first time in years, I believed we could find a balance between safety and adventure, between love and desire. Whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't lose myself again. Months have passed since that fateful dinner, and I find myself reflecting on everything with a clarity I didn't think possible back then. The memory of Marcus still lingers, not as a shadow of guilt, but as a reminder, a turning point in my life. It wasn't just about him or what happened between us, it was about the woman I became because of it. That night forced me to confront parts of myself I had long ignored. Desires, fears, and boundaries I never took the time to understand. And while it still haunts me occasionally, I no longer see it as something to be ashamed of. Instead, it feels like the moment I began to truly grow. Daniel and I are closer now than we've been in years. Our conversations have deepened, shedding the surface level exchanges for something richer, more honest. We laugh more, talk more, and even dream together again. There's an ease between us that had faded over time, replaced by routine and unspoken distance. But those walls came down when I chose vulnerability over silence, sharing pieces of myself, the good, the messy, the uncertain, brought us back to each other. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when fear almost kept me quiet, but every step forward felt worth it. As for Marcus, I keep him at arm's length. He tries to engage sometimes, his smirk hinting at some unspoken confidence. But I refuse to let him hold power over me anymore. What happened in the past, and I won't give him space in my present. Forgiveness has come slowly, not for him, but for myself. I've learned that growth often stems from discomfort. And though I wish things had unfolded differently, I can't deny how much stronger I am now. I've forgiven myself for my role in that encounter, recognizing it as part of my journey rather than a defining flaw. Vulnerability taught me strength, honesty brought wisdom, and through it all, I found alignment with who I truly am. Life isn't perfect, but it's fuller now, richer. For the first time in years, I feel whole. And that, I realize, is the greatest gift of all.